The clay is cool against your fingertips, four-sided dense, heavier than it looks. In the climate-controlled vault beneath the Aeolian Museum in Oxford, England, an object no larger than a shoebox sits behind protective glass. Its catalog number reads AN9-23444. Archaeologists call it the Weld-Blundell prism, and from the outside, it looks almost ordinary. A block of fired earth, a museum thing, a relic. But what it contains does not behave like a relic. It behaves like a doorway. Because the Sumerians who pressed those wedge-shaped marks into wet clay 4,000 years ago did not frame this as a story. They framed it as a record of when kingship descended from heaven before the flood swept over the earth, and what came after. And somewhere between before the flood and after the flood, the text leaves a silence so clean it almost feels deliberate. Wherever you are right now, late evening, settling into darkness, or early morning before the world wakes, notice what it feels like to listen to a document that refuses to explain itself. If you want to leave a quiet comment about where you're listening from, not as a call to action, not as a demand, just as a small mark like a wedge in clay, a way of saying, I was here for this question. Because others in other time zones, in other rooms, are following the same trail of evidence. It begins with this prism, and it ends, if it ends at all, with a question that doesn't sit politely in the mind. What if these ancient texts are not mythology at all, but documentation, not proof, not certainty, not an argument carved in stone, but documentation people, recording what they believed happened, what they thought they saw, what they inherited as memory strong enough to fire into permanence. The prism's surface is covered in cuneiform script, tiny wedge-shaped impressions pressed into clay before it hardened. Column after column names cities' kings' reign lengths. A list that begins in a time the text calls before the flood, when kingship first descended from heaven to the city of Eridu. 8 kings ruled in 5 cities during this antediluvian period, and their combined reign spans 241,200 years. The mind tries to blink it away. It tries to convert it into symbol, into metaphor, into the harmless language of myth. 241,000 years, 8 kings, 5 cities, and then, almost casually, a single line, the flood swept over. After that line, everything changes. The kings who follow rule for decades, not millennia. The numbers become human. The cities rebuild. The list continues in the same format. City king reign length, yet the world inside the numbers has shifted from something vast and ungraspable into something that resembles human biography. But between those two sections, before the flood, after the flood, the text is silent about what actually happened. It records the fact of catastrophe. It marks the division. It does not explain. And the longer you sit with that silence, the more it feels like a pressure. Because silence in a document like this is not emptiness. It's a boundary. For explanation, we have to leave the prism and move into the wider archive. Hundreds of tablets excavated from the ruins of Sumerian cities over the past century and a half. Translated, slowly debated, endlessly preserved in museums that keep their own kind of quiet. These tablets speak of beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki gods in conventional interpretation. A council of divine beings who made decisions about humanity's fate. A deliberative body, an administrative core. not merely colorful personalities, but authorities. And scattered throughout these texts are descriptions of conflict destruction weapons that do not sit comfortably inside Bronze Age imagination and consequences that scorch the earth itself. This script follows one investigation. Not to claim it is true, not to demand belief, but to ask whether the evidence allows the question, what if these texts preserve not religious allegory, but eyewitness documentation? What if the War of the Anunnaki described in Sumerian literature was a real event that physically damaged the planet? And what we call mythology is the strained human attempt to record what was seen. We are not claiming this is true. We're examining whether the documents allow the question to remain open. The prism sits silent in Oxford, but it is not alone. In the British Museum, in the University of Pennsylvania's collection, in the Louvre, in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, in Berlin's Verisier Titius Museum, thousands of other tablets wait. And they tell the same story from different angles. They describe the same catastrophe in different languages. They preserve fragments of something that happened, or something the Sumerians believed happened, with enough conviction that they pressed it into clay and fired it into permanence. Tonight we read those tablets not as mythology, not as primitive religion, but as documents, reports, records, attempts at explanation, written by people who lived in the aftermath of something they could barely comprehend. They did not have our categories. They did not have our sciences. They had the language of gods and the vocabulary of war. And they used those tools the way we use ours to preserve meaning, to preserve warning, to preserve sequence. The vault closes in 30 minutes. The climate control hums. The prism waits as it has waited for 4,000 years for someone to ask the right question. Not, did this happen? Because that question can become a trap, an argument, a fight. But what does the text actually say? And what would it mean if they were trying to tell us the truth? Before the flood swept over the Sumerian king list, exists in at least 18 different exemplars, clay tablets, cuneiform, cylinders, prisms like the one in Oxford. Each version differs slightly, names spelled differently, numbers shifting here and there, but the structure remains consistent. This was not one master text. It was copied, recopied, transmitted across centuries. Scribes in different cities and different periods created their own editions. The Weld Blundell prism, dating to approximately 1800 BC from the city of Lhasa, is simply the most complete version we possess. And what makes it significant is not the list itself, it's the division it marks. Chronology moving from city to city, then interrupted violently, completely, by something the text calls the flood. Before the interruption, 8 rulers across 5 cities, Eridu, Badira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. These cities existed. Excavations confirm their locations, their layers, their phases of rebuilding. But the reign lengths attributed to their antediluvian kings stretch credibility to the breaking point. 2,800 years, 36,000 years, 18,643,200. Mainstream scholarship reads these numbers as mythological symbol scribes, establishing divine legitimacy, pushing civilization back into deep antiquity. But the text itself does not change tone when it crosses the flood line. The format doesn't shift. The confidence doesn't waver. It simply states, before. Then the flood swept over. After the floodline, the list continues as if nothing has happened, yet everything has happened. The Sumerian king list does not pause to mourn. It does not pause to explain. It does not pause to justify. It simply resumes the same procedural rhythm: city king, reign length, succession. The form stays steady while the world behind the form shifts. The first king to rule after the flood is Gushar of Kish, whose reign lasted 1,200 years. Still impossible by modern standards, still beyond anything we would place inside ordinary human life. But compared to the antediluvian numbers, it feels smaller. It feels like something shrinking. Then the next reign, 960 years, then 840, then 720. And as the list moves forward closer to the periods where archaeology and later chronologies begin to overlap, the reign lengths continue to decrease until they resemble something human decades, not millennia. By the time we reach figures like Gilgamesh of Uruk, we're in the realm of plausible biography. The numbers become the kind of numbers a human body could carry. So the pattern is clear. The further back you go, the longer the reigns. The closer you get to verifiable history, the more human the numbers become. One way to read this is familiar and safe myth collapsing into history. A glorious past invented by scribes, gradually narrowing into reality as memory becomes more reliable. But another way to read it without adding new facts, only by lingering on what's already written, is to treat it as a compression problem. What if something about the method of timekeeping changed? What if the antediluvian period was real, in the sense that the scribes believed it was real, but the system of counting time, or remembering time, shifted after a rupture? Not because the world became metaphorical, but because the world became different. What if the scribes compiling the list centuries after the flood were working from fragmentary records they no longer fully understood, trying to translate old measures into new systems? This is speculation. But it is a speculation pulled from the structure of the text itself. Because the text does not signal the antediluvian section as legend. It does not mark it as metaphor. It presents it with the same matter-of-fact tone it uses for later kings. City name, king name, reign length, next city, next king, next reign. Then the flood swept over, and that line so brief functions like a blade. It cuts history into two worlds. Other Mesopotamian texts preserve this same before and after division. The Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian creation, and flood text, compiled around 1600 BC, describes the antediluvian period as a time when cities were founded, agriculture established, humanity multiplied. And then, in surviving lines, we encounter disturbance. The text is fragmentary here. Whole sections are missing. But what remains suggests the gods, specifically an Anunnaki council led by Enlil, grew disturbed by noise, by overpopulation, by behavior, by something that felt to them like an imbalance that required correction. And then the decision is made. Humanity would be destroyed by flood. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in Old Babylonian tablets from around 1700 BC, gives more detail. And it's here that something subtle but crucial becomes visible. Not a new idea, but a tone that repeats across the archive. Because Atrahasis does not describe divine whim. It describes procedure. It describes a sequence of attempted solutions. First plague, then drought, then famine. Each attempt fails or is subverted because Enki, sympathetic toward humanity, provides countermeasures. Humanity survives. Humanity rebounds. Humanity continues. And the council reconvenes. This cycle repeats until escalation becomes inevitable. Finally, the council agrees on the ultimate solution, a deluge that would wipe the earth clean. And what is striking is not merely the catastrophe, but the language used to justify it. It reads less like myth in the modern sense, and more like meeting minutes from a bureaucracy trying to handle a crisis. The Anunnaki meet. They debate. They try alternatives. When the alternatives fail, they escalate. And they describe this escalation in administrative terms, decrees council's decisions ratified by the assembly. Even if one reads this as theology, the structure is not poetic chaos. It is orderly. It is procedural. It is managerial. And then the flood comes. Multiple Mesopotamian texts describe it. Eridu, Genesis, Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, the King List. Details vary, but the core remains stable water, overwhelming catastrophic humanity, nearly extinguished. One man survives named Ziusudra in Sumerian Atrahasis, in Akkadian tradition, Utnapishtim, in the Gilgamesh epic. He survives because one god warns him Enki, or Ea. The survivor builds a vessel, takes aboard the seed of civilization, weathers the catastrophe, emerges into a world fundamentally changed. And after the flood, the king list says kingship descends again from heaven, this time to Kish. The world is rebuilt, but it is not the same world. The texts do not explicitly say what broke. They only mark the discontinuity. Before long, reigns antediluvian cities, direct proximity between gods and humans. After shorter reigns, rebuilt cities' gods retreating into temples, receiving offerings, rather than walking among humanity, as they apparently once did. So the question returns again, not as a demand, but as a pressure that keeps coming back. What caused this division? The king list says the flood swept over. Other texts say the gods decided to destroy humanity, but none of them explain why the earth needed to be flooded, why total inundation was the final policy, the irreversible measure. What was happening in the antediluvian period that required such drastic intervention? To answer that, we have to look at texts that describe not the flood itself, but what came before it. Texts that speak of conflict, not between humans, but among the gods themselves. Texts that describe weapons warfare and consequences that sound less like tidy theology and more like documentation of something catastrophic. The Prism in Oxford records the fact of the division. It marks the before and after, but it doesn't tell us what happened between those two states. For that, we need tablets that speak more directly, tablets that describe battles in heaven that scarred the earth, tablets that name participants, describe weapons, and catalog damage. Those tablets exist. They've been sitting in museums for over a century. And what they describe is not a peaceful antediluvian paradise destroyed by divine judgment. They describe a war. There are moments in the history of scholarship when a text stops behaving like a text, when it stops feeling like literature or religion or myth, and begins to feel like a report that escaped its own century. One of those moments has a date. November 13th, 1872. A 32-year-old assistant at the British Museum named George Smith was cataloging fragments from the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria. The library had been excavated from the ruins of Nineveh decades earlier. Thousands of clay tablets, administrative records, royal annals, literary compositions, scientific treatises, many broken, most awaiting translation. Smith had taught himself to read cuneiform. He was working through fragments the way you work through rubble, methodically, piece by piece, letting the clay tell you what it can before you decide what it means. And then he found it. a tablet describing a great flood, a man who survives by building a boat, birds sent out to test where the waters have receded, a vessel coming to rest on a mountain. The text was damaged in places, but the story was clear, and it was older than the Bible. Smith's reaction was dramatic enough that museum records note it. He began removing his clothes in excitement. The discovery made international headlines. Here was the flood story predating Genesis by at least 1,000 years, written by a civilization that vanished before Solomon built his temple. The tablet became known simply as the Flood Tablet. Its catalog number is K3375. It is Tablet C of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it sits in the British Museum to this day behind protective glass, its cuneiform script as clear as the day it was pressed into wet clay, fired and sealed into permanence. But there is something George Smith found that did not make the same headlines. Because the flood in the Gilgamesh epic is not a natural disaster, it is a weapon, deployed deliberately by beings the text calls gods. Acting under the direction of a council, the texts call the Anunnaki. And once you see that you can't unsee it, Tablet C does not merely tell you that water rose and the world drowned. It tells you there was a decision process. The gods have determined that humanity must be destroyed. The text does not fully explain why. It gestures toward noise, toward proliferation, toward some unnamed disturbance that made the world feel unmanageable to its administrators. But the decision is made. Enlil, head of the council, proposes the flood. The other Anunnaki agree. Only one dissents, Ea, the god of wisdom and fresh water, sympathetic to humanity. Ea cannot prevent the flood. The council has voted, but he can subvert it. And the method of subversion matters because it is procedural, too. Ea does not openly defy the council. He finds a loophole. He speaks through a wall. He directs his warning to a reed structure, knowing the human on the other side will hear. Build a boat, make it watertight. Bring aboard your family and the seeds of all living things. And then the tablet does something that myths do not need to do. It gives construction details, dimensions, materials, waterproofing methods using bitumen and pitch, structural reinforcement. The kind of detail you can imagine someone preserving not because it makes a story prettier, but because it makes survival possible. Utnapishtim builds the vessel following specifications. And then the flood arrives. And the description is worth reading carefully, not quickly, not as spectacle, but as evidence of what the text is trying to convey. At first light of dawn, a black cloud rises on the horizon. Inside it, the storm god thunders. The gods of destruction go before it. Messengers of death cross mountain and plain. The god of the whirlwind tears loose the mooring poles. Ninurta comes and bursts the dams. And then this line that keeps returning hauntingly across the tradition. The Anunnaki lifted their torches, setting the land ablaze with their brightness, fire in the middle of flood. The storm god turns daylight to darkness, smashing the land like a pot. For 6 days and 6 nights the winds blow. The flood and tempest overwhelm the land. When the 7th day arrives, the storm subsides. This does not read like rain. It reads like coordinated force. Storm gods, gods of destruction, messengers of death. Dams burst deliberately, torches lifted. And notice the verbs. The land is smashed. It is battered. The language is violent in a way that feels operational, not merely poetic. And the Anunnaki are not distant. They are present. They participate. They are part of the machinery of destruction. When the waters recede, the vessel comes to rest on Mount Nisir. Utnapishtim sends out birds to test the world. A dove, a swallow, a raven. And then he disembarks and offers sacrifice. And the gods smell the offering and gather around it like flies. It is a strange image until you remember what the text implies: humanity provided offerings. Humanity is now gone. The gods are hungry. They have destroyed their own supply chain. And in that hunger, something like regret surfaces. Enlil arrives and is furious when he discovers humans survived. How did they escape? Who warned them? Ea admits his role and argues that the punishment was disproportionate. Humanity's crimes, whatever they were, did not warrant extinction. Enlil's rage subsides. And then the conclusion arrives like a quiet administrative settlement. After catastrophic policy, Enlil grants Utnapishtim and his wife immortality as compensation. They are taken to dwell at the mouth of the rivers, a far-off place removed from the world. The gods return to their cities. The earth slowly repopulates. But it is a different earth now. Something has been lost that cannot be recovered. And here the story loops back into the king list again, because the king list doesn't tell you the flood story, it tells you the consequence. Before the flood, impossibly long reigns, a world that does not behave like ours. After the flood, reigns, shrinking numbers, turning human kingship, descending again, as if a system had been rebooted. The Gilgamesh tablet does not say in modern terms the earth was damaged, but it says it in its own language. It says the land was smashed like pottery. It says torches set the land ablaze. It says darkness swallowed daylight. It says all of humanity returned to clay. And it says the gods themselves, administrators, council members, decision makers, witnessed the outcome and regretted the scale of what they had authorized. So the question returns again, and it returns in the exact form the tablets invite. If this is myth, why does it read like policy? If this is allegory, why does it preserve specifications? If this is invented theology, why does it include mechanisms, votes, oaths, loopholes, enforcement, like a bureaucracy managing a crisis? The Gilgamesh version is the most famous flood account, but the archive insists it is not alone. Earlier fragments exist. Other traditions echo the same decision, the same counsel, the same logic of escalation, the same pattern disturbance deliberation decree catastrophe aftermath regret. And that means the flood story as the tablets presented is not a standalone fable. It is a node in a wider network of texts describing governance conflict and control, especially control over something. The tablets keep circling around with a kind of anxious reverence. Authority. Who has it? How it is granted? How it is stolen? How the cosmos itself destabilizes when authority is removed from its rightful holder. The object they call the Tablet of Destinies. The flood tablets give us policy and consequence. They give us decision implementation aftermath. But they also hint quietly, insistently, that the flood was not the first time the gods used overwhelming force. That catastrophe was not a single event in a single story, that it belonged to a larger pattern authority, contested authority, Stolen authority reclaimed, each struggle leaving scars. And when the tablets want to talk about authority, they return again and again to one object. A thing that can be worn, a thing that can be stolen, a thing that grants the holder the power to decree what happens next. They call it the Tablet of Destinies. And the text that places that tablet at the center of reality itself is the Enuma Elish. It begins before cities, before kings, before humans, before the flood. When heaven and earth split apart, so the story tells it, there was no heaven and no earth. There was Atsu, the freshwater deep, and Tiamat, the saltwater sea, mingling their waters together. From that primordial mixture, the first gods emerged. And almost immediately, the first gods created a problem. Scholars call it a creation myth. But if you read it slowly, without rushing to classify it, it behaves more like a war chronicle. The young gods once born disturb Apsu and Tiamat with their activity. They are loud, restless, intrusive. Apsu cannot sleep. Tiamat tolerates them. Apsu does not. He plots to eliminate the younger generation. He calls his vizier Mumu. He prepares to do what later texts will describe as policy: remove the population that has become unmanageable. Tiamat resists. They are her offspring. But Apsu is determined. The young gods learn of the plot, and the wisest among them, devises a countermeasure. He casts a spell that puts Apsu into deep sleep, then kills him. And from Apsu's corpse, establishes his dwelling place. Already the pattern is visible. A threat is perceived. A decision is made. A countermeasure is deployed. The text does not pause to moralize. It simply moves. In E's dwelling, his son Marduk is born extraordinary. The text insists not merely strong, but structurally different. 4 eyes to see in all directions, 4 ears to hear everything, a mouth that breathes fire when he speaks. And when Tiamat learns of Apsu's death, her tolerance ends. She declares war, not metaphorical conflict war. She creates an army of monsters, serpents, dragons, scorpion men, storm demons, fishmen, bullmen, 11 types of creatures fashioned specifically for battle. And to lead them, she chooses Kingu. Then comes the object. Tiamat gives Kingu the Tablet of Destinies and fastens it to his breast. The text is explicit about what this means. Supreme authority, the power to issue decrees that cannot be countermanded, control over fate itself. With the Tablet of Destinies on his chest, Kingu becomes invincible. That's how the text frames it matter of fact, as if the mechanism is understood. It does not explain how the tablet works. It does not justify why it has this power. It treats the tablet the way modern systems treat an access key possession equals authority. And then it shows you what happens when authority shifts hands. Tiamat's army assembles. The young gods panic. Who killed Apsu, tries to face Tiamat and fails. Anu approaches her and retreats. None of the established powers can stand against her. Because the tablet has changed what is possible. Whatever Kingu decrees with that tablet becomes reality. That is what the text insists. That is what the text repeats in different forms. Authority is not persuasion. Authority is not prestige. Authority is decree. Then Marduk steps forward, young, untested, but offering a solution. He will fight Tiamat on one condition. If he wins, he becomes head of the pantheon. The other gods swear allegiance. His word becomes law. Again, notice the structure. This is not simply heroism. It is negotiation. Power is exchanged. Authority is ratified. The council agrees. They test Marduk's power, having him speak a garment out of existence, then speak it back into being. It works. They clothe him in authority. They give him weapons, bow, mace, lightning, a net held by the four winds, and then they send him to face Tiamat. The battle is described in remarkable detail. Marduk rides a storm chariot drawn by four creatures, Killer, Pitilus, Trampler, Flyer. He creates 7 hurricanes to confuse Tiamat's forces. He approaches her directly. Words of challenge. Then wins. Then net. He catches Tiamat in his net. When she opens her mouth to swallow him, he drives the winds down her throat, inflating her body. While she is immobilized, he shoots an arrow through her belly, splitting her heart. Tiamat dies. Her army flees. Marduk captures Kingu and takes the tablet of destinies from his breast. Then he seals it with his own seal and fastens it to his own chest. The object changes hands. The cosmos changes with it. Marduk returns to Tiamat's corpse and begins the work of creation. He splits her body in half like a dried fish. From one half, he makes the sky, setting it as a barrier to hold back her upper waters. From the other half, he makes the earth, establishing foundations. He assigns gods to stations. He creates stars. He sets the calendar. He establishes movements of celestial bodies. And then comes the question that echoes later in Atrahasis: who will do the work? The gods are tired. They want rest. Who will bear the burden? Marduk proposes the solution: create humans from the blood of the god who instigated the war. The council identifies Kingu. Kingu is executed. From his blood mixed with clay, the first humans are fashioned. Their purpose: serve the gods, bear their burden, so the gods can rest. This is the Enuma Elish. Mainstream interpretation reads it as cosmogony order, emerging from chaos, Babylon's god rising to supremacy, humanity assigned its place. Violence as metaphor, Tiamat as symbol of the untamed sea. But the text, if you read it as documentation, describes a war between factions of beings called gods, fought with weapons that affect physical reality, resulting in a death, a seizure of authority, and a restructuring of the world from a corpse. And this is where the question becomes uncomfortable, because the text is too specific to dismiss quickly and too impossible to accept easily. If Tiamat's body becomes the sky and the earth, then the planet is, according to the text, the repurposed remains of a defeated enemy. If the tablet confers decree power, if whoever holds it can make reality obey, then the wars over it are not spiritual allegories. They are power struggles over control mechanisms. And suddenly the flood tablets look different, because if a tablet can decree fate, then a decree to flood the earth would flood the earth. A decree to scorch a land would scorch a land. This is not a claim, it is the logical shape inside the texts themselves. The Enuma Elish shows the tablet granting absolute authority. The flood tablets show a council authorizing absolute catastrophe. And if you connect those points even cautiously, you begin to see why later myths obsess over theft. Because if authority can be stolen, then catastrophe can be stolen too. The story of Anzu, the tablet of destinies, does not behave like an idea in these texts. It behaves like an object. It can be carried. It can be sealed. It can be worn on the chest. It can be removed from one chest and fastened to another. And most disturbing of all, in the logic of the stories, it can be taken when the rightful holder is distracted. Which means authority in the Mesopotamian imagination is not merely earned, it is possessed. And if it is possessed, then it can be stolen. The texts that describe this theft do not frame it as philosophy. They frame it as crisis. They frame it like a system failure. The thief is Anzu, lion-headed, eagle-bodied, storm-winged. Ancient art depicts it as a creature of talons and roar. But the most significant thing Anzu does is not physical. It steals the tablet of destinies from Enlil, head of the Anunnaki Council. The theft is preserved in multiple accounts, but the most complete survives in the standard Babylonian version of the Anzu epic, preserved in tablets from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh and other sites. The story begins with Anzu serving as gatekeeper to Enlil's throne room. Every morning, Enlil bathes in sacred water before entering his chamber to conduct divine business. And one morning, while Enlil bathes, Anzu sees his opportunity. The tablet lies unguarded in the throne room. Anzu seizes it and flies to his mountain stronghold. The result is immediate chaos, not emotional chaos, administrative chaos. Without the tablet, Enlil cannot issue binding decrees. Divine authority collapses. The regular order of the cosmos falters. The text describes this collapse in the language of governance. Decisions cannot be made. Commands have no force. The machinery of creation grinds toward paralysis. So Enlil calls an emergency council. Someone must retrieve the tablet, but who can face Anzu? Whoever possesses the tablet of destinies has absolute power. Any attack against the holder fails because the holder can decree that attacks fail. That is the problem the story refuses to let you simplify. This is not merely monster versus hero. This is, how do you fight someone who controls the outcome? The gods nominate candidates. E declines. Anu declines. Finally, Ninurta, the warrior god son of Enlil, accepts the mission. But even Ninurta faces what the text treats as a near impossible constraint. How do you fight someone who can control fate? Ninurta flies to Anzu's mountain. He draws his bow. He fires arrows. And every arrow stops in midair and falls harmlessly to the ground because Anzu, holding the tablet, decrees that no weapon can harm him. Ninurta returns defeated. The council reconvenes, and here the text shifts from battle narration into something that feels like problem solving, like the gods are not merely angry, but constrained by a system they cannot override. E, the god of wisdom, devises a strategy. Ninurta must strike so quickly, with such overwhelming speed, that Anzu cannot issue a counter-decree before the blow lands. The solution is a special arrow crafted by E, an arrow that will fly faster than thought. Ninurta returns to the mountain. He draws his bow, and this time he does not aim for Anzu's body, as if brute force could solve the problem. He aims for Anzu's wing. The arrow flies. It strikes before Anzu can react. The wing is severed. Anzu falls from the sky. Ninurta seizes the fallen creature, recovers the tablet of destinies, and returns it to Enlil. Order is restored. Ninurta is hailed as savior of the gods. Enlil rewards him with titles and authority. The crisis ends. The tablet is secured, presumably better guarded, but the story has already revealed what it needed to reveal. The tablet was vulnerable. It could be stolen. And in the wrong hands, it granted absolute command authority. This suggests the tablet is not merely a metaphor for destiny. It behaves like a mechanism, an administrative token, a credential, an authority key. And notice what the story does not say. It does not say the tablet was locked by magic. It does not say it was bound to Enlil's body. It does not say it could only be used by the rightful owner. It simply says it was there, and whoever held it had power. This is consistent with a physical control mechanism rather than a purely mystical concept. And if you allow that possibility even briefly, the implications begin to stack. In the Enuma Elish, Tiamat gives the tablet to Kingu, making him invincible until Marduk takes it. In the Anzu epic, Anzu steals it from Enlil, destabilizing order until Ninurta recovers it. In these stories, wars are fought over it not because it is sacred in a poetic sense, but because possession determines what can be done. What is the Tablet of Destinies? The texts treat it as understood. Modern readers don't understand. We can only infer from context. It grants decree power. It stabilizes order. It is central enough that its theft halts governance itself. And once you see the tablet framed this way, the flood stories shift again. Because the flood is described as a decree, an executive decision authorized by the Anunnaki Council. Disease, drought, famine, those are attempted implementations. Flood is the final escalation. If a mechanism exists that can implement decrees at planetary scale, then the tablet becomes not a symbol, but a lever. And if different factions fight over that lever, then the war of the gods becomes less like poetry and more like a struggle over infrastructure, over the controls of whatever system makes the world behave. This is speculation. But it is speculation anchored in what the texts insist the tablet exists. It is stolen, it is recovered, and the world changes when it changes hands. So now the question turns again the way it keeps turning in these documents. If the flood was a decree, what tool executed it? If catastrophes are voted on, what mechanism implements votes? If the gods can scorch land and flood earth, is that power, personal or administrative, routed through devices, through tokens, through authority systems, the text called the Lugal Epic? If the Tablet of Destinies is the mechanism of authority, then the next question becomes almost unavoidable. What does authority do when it is deployed on the ground? What does it look like when the war of the gods is not told at the scale of creation? Sky split from sea corpse split into earth, but at the scale of terrain, rivers, mountains, and cities that could be drowned. Because the archive does not only speak in cosmic language, it also speaks in operational language. It preserves a story that does not feel like cosmogony at all. It feels like aftermath. It feels like a campaign report. And it is preserved in a text known as the Lugal Epic, often referred to by its opening words, Lugal-e, O King, the storm of splendor is mighty. The king is Ninurta, son of Enlil, warrior god, the one who retrieved order when order was stolen, the one whose authority is always described as delegated, derived, ratified. And the storm of splendor is not poetry in a gentle sense. It is battle. The Lugal Epic stretches across hundreds of lines, inscribed across multiple tablets, and what follows is not a creation myth, and not a moral parable. It is war told in the ritual language of gods, but structured like a sequence of events. Ninurta, travels to the mountains. The text calls them the Kur, a word that can mean mountain foreign land or underworld, depending on context, which already tells you something. This is a boundary region, a place where categories blur, a place that is not the settled city. There he encounters an enemy named Asog. The description is damaged in places, but what survives is consistent in tone, something monstrous, something hostile, something that has to be stopped. And Asog's army is strange. Not soldiers, not chariots, not human forces, stones, minerals, named one by one as if the text is cataloging the composition of an enemy rather than the identity of a nation. This is where the story becomes difficult to place in any comfortable genre. Because even if you read it as myth, it insists on specificity. It insists on material detail. It insists on lists. And then we meet Ninurta's weapon. It is called Shiru, described as a mace, but not a normal mace. A mace that can speak. A mace that can fly independently. A mace that can scout ahead of its master and return with information. The text gives Shiru dialogue. It reports to Ninurta about enemy positions. It offers tactical advice. At one point, it flies back to the city of Nippur to inform Ninurta's mother about the battle's progress and to request her blessing for her son's victory. Again, the text is not coy about this. It does not frame Shiru as symbolic inspiration. It treats it as an acting participant in the campaign, a weapon with agency, a weapon with intelligence, a weapon that moves through space and carries information. And using Shiru, Ninurta defeats Asog. The mountains tremble. And then comes the consequence that links this mountain war back to the flood text, not as a repetition, but as a rhyme. Because the text says Asog's power had dammed up waters in the mountains. And when Asog fell, those waters were released. They flooded down to the plains. They threatened to destroy the cities of Sumer. So the story does not end with victory. It immediately becomes crisis management. Ninurta responds by building a barrier of stones, creating a dam that redirects the waters into the Tigris River. The cities are saved, the floodwaters are controlled, and then Ninurta returns home victorious. But before leaving the mountains, he does something that makes the entire episode feel less like myth and more like procedure. He gathers the stones that formed Asog's army, and he pronounces judgment on each one. Some he blesses, others he curses. The text provides a catalog. This stone will be chief among stones. This stone will be fit for jewels and worthy of palace use. This stone will be chosen for statues. This stone will be valued by decision makers. And then another stone is bad cast aside, another thrown into desert, another used for nothing. Dozens of materials are assigned fates, and the catalog reads like applied geology, determining which minerals have use and which do not. But the text frames it as divine judgment, issued after military victory. So you have a sequence that keeps repeating in different forms. There is a threat, there is a battle, there is collateral consequence, water-released catastrophe looming. There is emergency engineering barrier, built waters redirected. There is evaluation materials, sorted assigned functions discarded or preserved. And hovering behind it is the idea of authority. Because the text connects Ninurta's ability to judge stones to Enlil's authority. Authority rooted in this tradition, in the same mechanism we keep returning to the Tablet of Destinies. In other words, the judgment is not merely personal preference. It is administrative decree. It is an authorized sorting of the world. Now, conventional interpretation reads this as etiological myth, a just-so story explaining why lapis is precious and mud is worthless. Ninurta's judgments become a poetic explanation for the natural order of minerals. But within the text itself, another reading becomes difficult to ignore, not because it is provable, but because the structure of the story invites it. What if the stones were not only stones? What if the army of stones is the later scribal way of describing enemy materials, objects, constructions, remnants that by the time the story was written down had become indistinguishable from rock? What if the narrative preserves memory of a conflict in mountainous terrain involving engineered systems, dams holding back water barriers, redirecting flow, and leaving behind material debris that required evaluation? Because the text does not merely say a monster was slain. It says water control systems were involved. It says flooding was released. It says the response required building a barrier and redirecting waters. And it says afterwards the materials in the mountains were judged one by one for usefulness or danger. If you take the language literally, it is divine decree over geology. If you take the language as documentation filtered through myth, it reads like quality control. Sorting captured materials after a battle, determining what is safe for human use, what is valuable, what is hazardous, what should be discarded. And either way, mythic or documentary, the same pattern persists. Conflict produces environmental consequence. Environmental consequence threatens civilization. Authority intervenes to stabilize. That is exactly what the flood stories depict too, only at a larger scale. The flood stories describe the Anunnaki intentionally flooding the earth. The Lugal epic describes flooding as consequence of mountain warfare. Intentional or collateral, global or regional, the structural rhyme remains water catastrophe, tied to divine conflict. And there is another detail the text preserves that is easy to glide past if you read quickly. When Ninurta returns home to Nippur, the city celebrates. Offerings are made, titles are bestowed. But the text also says the gods were relieved. Relieved. As if the outcome had not been inevitable. As if something truly dangerous had been at stake. As if had Ninurta failed, the waters would have flooded uncontrolled, the cities would have been destroyed, the stones, whatever they represent, would have remained dangerous. So the Lugal epic is not about creation. It is about aftermath. It is about stabilizing damage. It is about preventing secondary catastrophe. It is about restoring order after an event in the mountains that threatened to spill down into the world humans lived in. And the more you read the Mesopotamian archive, the more you realize this is what it keeps returning to, not the beauty of beginnings, but the fragility of systems. Systems that can be disrupted, systems that can collapse, systems that require intervention, engineering, decree authority, the tablet that controls fate, the weapon that speaks, the dam that redirects floodwaters, the catalog that assigns value and danger. These are not the shapes of a simple fairy tale. These are the shapes of a world managed and sometimes damaged by powers above human reach. And that brings us to the next question. The tablets keep circling again and again in slightly different language each time. Who are the ones who decide? Who sits in the assembly? Who votes? Who decrees? Because the texts do not portray the Anunnaki as a vague cloud of divinity. They portray them as a council. The Lugal epic leaves you with an image that is hard to forget. A warrior returning from the mountains. Floodwaters redirected before they can erase the cities. Materials judged one by one, blessed cursed assigned function, assigned danger. And behind all of it, authority not merely strength, but the right to decree. So the question tightens, not who was strong enough to win, but who was authorized to decide. Because in Mesopotamian literature, the Anunnaki are not merely gods in the sense of distant forces. They are administrators. They convene. They deliberate. They vote. And they produce decisions that become reality. Across different texts, their number shifts. Some sources speak of 7 Anunnaki. Others mention 50. There are references to hundreds assigned to heaven, assigned to earth. But the most consistent portrayal is not a head count. It is a function. They are the ones who decree fate. They sit in council. They issue judgments. And once a judgment is issued, the texts treat it as binding like law. This council function appears again and again in the flood traditions. In Atrahasis, when the lesser gods rebel against their labor, the Anunnaki convene to address the crisis. Anu presides. Enlil speaks. Enki offers solutions. A decision is made, create humanity to take over the work. Later, when humanity becomes too numerous and noisy, the cycle repeats. Enlil proposes plague. The council agrees. Enki subverts the implementation. The council reconvenes. Enlil proposes drought. Agreement again. Enki finds workarounds again. This continues until the final escalation flood the earth completely. What is striking is the tone. Not the imagery, not the symbolism, the tone. It is bureaucratic. Proposals, alternatives, votes, oaths, implementation, assessment, adjustment. It reads less like a myth invented to soothe the mind, and more like governance described by people who lived under it. The texts even specify where this council meets. In several sources, the assembly gathers at Nippur in the temple of Enlil, called the Ikur. Nippur is not the largest city. It is not a political capital in the ordinary sense. No dynasty rules from Nippur as a seat of kingship. And yet it is the religious center, the place where divine authority is concentrated. The Ikur is not described as merely a building. It is described as the mountain house connecting heaven and earth, the place where fates are decreed. Archaeology confirms Nippur's importance through its massive temple complexes, rebuilt and expanded over centuries. The text and the ruins agree on this much. This place mattered. And in the flood narratives, the Anunnaki's role is not implied. It is explicit. The Gilgamesh account says the Anunnaki lifted their torches, setting the land ablaze with their radiance. They were present. They participated. The Eridu Genesis says the 7 Anunnaki decreed the flood. Atrahasis says Enlil called the council and obtained their oath not to warn humanity. In every version, the flood is not weather. It is executive action, voted on, authorized, implemented. And once you accept that the texts present it this way, another question becomes difficult to avoid. Accountability. If the Anunnaki decreed the flood, and the flood killed nearly everyone, then by the logic of the texts themselves, the Anunnaki are responsible. And the archive does not entirely hide this. The Gilgamesh epic acknowledges regret. After the waters recede, the gods gather around the sacrifice like flies hungry, desperate, drawn to what humans provide. The goddess Ninhursag weeps. Her grief is explicit. How could I speak evil in the assembly of the gods? How could I order battle to destroy my people? It is I who gave birth to these humans. Now, like fish, they fill the sea. Her lament is not subtle. The decision was wrong. The implementation was catastrophic. But it was too late to undo. Even Enlil, who pushed for the flood, eventually concedes. When he discovers that Utnapishtim survived his initial rage, gives way to resignation. EA argues that the punishment was disproportionate, that humanity's crimes did not warrant extinction. Enlil accepts. He grants immortality as compensation. And in doing so, he admits something without saying it directly. The council's authority is real, and so is its capacity to err. And this is the hinge that shifts the entire mood of the archive. Because after the flood, the text suggests that something changed not only for humans, but for the gods. The post-flood world has shorter reigns. The post-flood world has gods more distant. The immediacy is gone. Before the flood, the texts preserve a sense of direct divine-human interaction. After the flood, gods retreat into temples, communicating through priests, receiving offerings, but not walking among the people in the same way. Why the texts do not state it directly? They only give us a pattern and invite us to think inside it. One possibility is guilt. The gods regret the flood. They mourn, they argue, they compensate the survivor. Perhaps withdrawal is restraint, an attempt to limit intervention after realizing intervention can destroy. Another possibility is capacity. If the flood was implemented through mechanisms of decree, if the act of forcing the world to flood carried strain, then perhaps the system was damaged by its own use. Perhaps the catastrophe was not cost-free for those who executed it. Perhaps something in their capacity changed. A third possibility is political consequence. Atrahasis shows division within the council. Enlil pushing for reduction. Enki subverting the assembly, forcing oaths, loopholes exploited. If the flood was controversial even among the gods, then its aftermath may have altered council dynamics. A divided administration does not operate like a unified one. Again, the texts do not choose for us. They record, they preserve, they show votes, oaths, subversions, regrets. They leave the causal explanation open. But the open space is not empty, it has shape. And the shape is this: the flood broke something. Not merely bodies, not merely cities. Something in the relationship between authority and the world it managed. And once you see that, you begin to see why the archive preserves not only the global catastrophe, but also local catastrophes, city-specific destructions attributed to the same council logic. Because if the Anunnaki can decree a flood, they can decree the fall of a city. And the texts insist repeatedly that they did. Which brings us next to the documents that do not describe the end of the world, but the end of a world, a single city, turned to ash, its gods departing its streets, empty, its people scattered. The laments, the text that asks over and over why the assembly chose annihilation. The lament for If the flood is the archive's largest gesture, its bluntest reset, then the laments are something else. They are smaller in scale, narrower in geography, but in some ways more intimate. Because a flood can be told as destiny, as inevitability, as the kind of thing the sky does. But a city being erased its streets, emptied its temple ash, its people scattered, requires a different kind of language. It requires naming. It requires mourning. It requires the stubborn, unbearable question, why this one? And among the laments that survived from ancient Mesopotamia, one stands out as a kind of wound that never fully closed. The Lament for Ur, compiled around 2000 BC, it describes the destruction of what had been one of the greatest cities of Sumer. And the language is haunting precisely because it feels like memory that has been polished into poetry without being softened. The city was burned. Its people were killed or scattered. Its temples were abandoned. Its gods departed. And the text asks again and again why this happened and who was responsible. The lament survives in multiple tablets excavated from Nippur and other sites now distributed among museums. It was copied, preserved, treated as important enough to keep reinscribing long after the smoke had cleared. Samuel Kramer, translating fragments in the 20th century, identified it as one of the earliest examples of a genre that would continue throughout Mesopotamian history, the city lament. When a city fell, scribes composed texts describing the destruction, mourning what was lost, asking the gods why they allowed it. But the lament for Ur is unusual in one crucial way. It doesn't primarily blame human enemies. It blames the gods themselves. More specifically, it blames a decision made by the Anunnaki Council. The text opens by describing Ur before the catastrophe, thriving, prosperous, secure. Its patron goddess, Ningal, dwelt there in her temple. The moon god Inana was her consort. The people worshipped. The city flourished. And then the shift arrives, not gradual, not ambiguous, but sudden in tone. The Anunnaki made a decision. The great gods commanded annihilation. Enlil commanded its utter destruction. Its fate was determined. The city was to be destroyed. Its people were to be killed. And that language matters because it mirrors the flood accounts in structure, even while the event differs in scale. Not a war came, not a drought happened, not misfortune struck, but a judgment was issued. And the lament emphasizes that judgment with the kind of repetition that reads like a mind trying to accept what it cannot accept. A fate was spoken. A fate was sealed. A decision was made in the assembly. And once made, it could not be turned back. Ningal tries to prevent it. The text gives her voice. She pleads before the council. She reminds them of Ur's devotion. She argues against the destruction. She weeps. She begs. And the lament does something that the modern mind finds strangely chilling. It makes the goddess's failure part of the evidence. Because if even the city's patron deity cannot overturn the decision, then whatever this council is, it is not a metaphor for weather. It behaves like a hierarchy. It behaves like governance. The judgment of the assembly could not be turned back. The word of Enlil could not be overturned. And then comes the implementation, and here the lament's imagery aligns almost uncomfortably with the flood tablet language, as if the archive is using one vocabulary for catastrophe, regardless of whether the catastrophe is global or local. A storm comes, but not a storm in the way we would say a storm as weather. The lament frames it as a weapon sent, ordered, directed. A storm ordered by Enlil. a storm that wears away the land, a storm that covered it like a cloth, enveloped it like linen, a storm that annihilates. Fire burns through the city. People are piled up in heaps. The temple becomes ruin. Streets become silence. The lament's grief is procedural, too. Cataloging what is gone, naming what has been emptied, listing the places where sound used to be. And Ningal watches. She flees her temple, unable to bear the sight. She cries out bitterly. Her tears flow. She cannot protect her city. Her city has been destroyed. Its people have been killed. The lament continues for hundreds of lines, repeating the grief, returning to the same images, circling the same fact from different angles. The way a mind circles trauma, not because it's trying to be efficient, but because it's trying to understand. And eventually the text says Ningal and Inana return to the ruins. They find the city empty. The temples are ash. The people are gone. The goddess weeps. And the lament ends with a plea that someday might be rebuilt, its name restored, its people returned. Which, in historical terms, did happen. But the point of the lament is not reconstruction. It is the shock of destruction. Now, conventional archaeology offers a clean explanation. Ur's collapse around 2000 BC is often attributed to invasion human armies, political collapse, conquest from the east. Excavations show burning layers, debris, a gap in occupation consistent with trauma. In that reading, the lament is poetry written in the aftermath of war. Scribes explain the city's fall using theological language about divine abandonment, because that is how you talk about catastrophe in that world. But the lament itself keeps saying something different. It keeps insisting the gods decided. It keeps insisting the assembly voted. It keeps insisting a storm was sent. It keeps making the annihilation feel less like a chaotic accident and more like execution. And here the question returns again in different phrasing, because the archive itself invites this looping. If this is only theology, why preserve the language of procedure? If this is only metaphor, why describe council deliberation? If this is only a way to cope with invasion, why locate the source of destruction, not in human enemies, but in the assembly of gods? Because the lament for is not unique. Other Mesopotamian cities have similar lament texts, laments for Nippur, for Sumer, and for Uruk, for Eridu. The genre becomes so established that scribal templates existed, structures, formulas, repeated lines into which city-specific details could be placed, and that too is worth dwelling on. A culture does not create a stable lament template genre unless the experience it is responding to is recurring, recognizable, and severe. The lament genre suggests cities fell often enough, catastrophically enough, that mourning became formalized into literature. But the repeated insistence that the Anunnaki Council decided raises the deeper discomfort. Because if the text consistently blamed the council rather than the human enemy, then either the scribes are retrofitting divine causality onto human violence again and again until the pattern becomes a genre, or the scribes are preserving a memory that the forces destroying cities were not experienced as merely human. The simplest explanation is always that the gods are theological language, a way to name what humans could not control. And yet the archive keeps laying down procedural footprints, votes, decrees, storms deployed, judgments irreversible that feel oddly bureaucratic for pure poetry. And the lament for includes one detail that keeps dragging the reader back toward the physical, away from the symbolic. After describing the storm and the fire, the lament speaks of bodies without burial, death too widespread for ritual to contain infrastructure collapsing so completely that even mourning becomes impossible. Corpses dissolving, people dying not only by weapon, but by hunger, the dead not lying in shrouds. The city's life support system's food order ritual failing all at once. That is not the clean shape of a battlefield. That is what systemic failure looks like. And so we circle the question again because the lament circles it too. What happened to Was it invasion dressed in theology? Was it catastrophe blamed on divine will? Or was it within the logic of the texts themselves? Another instance of the same pattern. We've been tracing a council decreeing destruction, and destruction following by means described as storm and fire. The lament does not answer. It records. It mourns. It insists that whatever happened was big enough to require not only rebuilding stone and brick, but rebuilding meaning. And when you place the lament beside Atrahasis, beside Gilgamesh, beside Lugal-E, you begin to see the archive as a sequence of catastrophes, not one flood alone, but multiple events, different scales, different methods, the same recurring structure, decree, force aftermath. Which leads directly into the next kind of text, one that doesn't mourn destruction from the outside, but speaks destruction from the inside. A composition where the voice of catastrophe justifies itself. A text that reads almost unbearably like a manual for collapse. The era epic. The laments are the voice of survivors. They look at a city turned to ash and ask why. They look at streets emptied and temples silent and try to speak grief into a shape that can be carried forward. But the archive is not only survivor voice. It also contains something more unsettling, a text that speaks from the perspective of the destroyer, not from the perspective of a human general, not from the perspective of a conquering king, from the perspective of a god, one whose domain is not harvest or law or craftsmanship, but pestilence, war, and devastation. His name is Era, a god of plague and destruction, associated in Akkadian tradition, with scorching and burning, identified in earlier Sumerian currents with underworld power. And the text that preserves his mythology is not gentle. It does not behave like seasonal allegory or comforting ritual. It reads like propaganda. It reads like methodology. It reads like a field manual for breaking civilizations. The era epic survives in multiple copies, with a notably complete version preserved among tablets from Ashurbanipal's library, along with fragments from other sites. Scholars date the surviving composition to the 1st millennium BC, but it draws on older tradition, older ways of speaking about catastrophe that echo the flood cycle and the lament cycle. What makes Era unusual is not merely the destruction he causes, but the narrative stance. Era speaks. He explains himself. He justifies his actions. He describes his methods. And the epic begins not with human sin or cosmic imbalance, but with something more psychologically dangerous because it is so familiar. Restlessness. Era has been inactive, his weapons unused, his glory fading in the minds of people who have grown comfortable. And then come his companions, the 7 weapons called the Sebetu. They are described like beings and like instruments, at the same time sons born from heaven and underworld entities that know only destruction. They taunt him. Why do you sit in the city? Why don't you arise and fill the land with terror? The people no longer fear you. They have forgotten your strength. Let us go forth and show them what destruction means. The motive here is not justice. It is not strategy. It is not even grievance in any clean moral sense. It is reputation. It is the desire to be remembered through fear. An era hesitates because order exists in the world, and order has an administrator. Marduk maintains stability. Era cannot simply rampage without displacing the authority that holds things together. So, Era goes to Marduk and makes an argument that feels again strangely procedural, like politics, like bureaucracy, like the negotiation of control. Marduk's regalia and throne have grown tarnished. They need to be cleaned, refurbished. But this requires Marduk to temporarily leave his throne and go to the craftsman. Era offers to maintain order in his place while he is gone. Marduk agrees, warning Era not to abuse the responsibility. He leaves. And the moment the administrator steps away, the destructive actor takes the seat. Era betrays the trust immediately. He unleashes the Sebetu, and what follows is described in shocking detail. Not just plague came, not just war happened, but the deliberate dismantling of the structures that keep society functional. Era sets ablaze the upright and the wicked alike. He strikes down the righteous and the evil. He kills the priest in front of his god. He cuts down the king in his palace. He destroys sanctuaries. He demolishes city walls. He breaks gates. The destruction is indiscriminate. His purpose is not to punish specific wrongdoing. His purpose is to collapse the distinction between safe and unsafe to make every category fail. And then the epic becomes method. Era sends plague. He causes famine by preventing rains and destroying irrigation systems. He turns people against each other. Civil war, family conflict, neighbor against neighbor. He disrupts trade routes so goods cannot reach cities. He causes communication breakdown so coordination becomes impossible. He targets infrastructure, governance, commerce, water, food, social cohesion. He does not need to defeat an army if he can dissolve the systems that allow an army to exist. One passage lingers because it speaks in the language of severing, cutting, damning verbs that echo both the flood texts and the laments, but now with intent. He will sever the sinews of governance, cut the throat of the merchant, dam up springs, cut off canals, turn abundance into wasteland, eliminate the nursemaid, the nanny, the child, drive away from streets the happy sounds of the tavern. This is not a battlefield. This is designed collapse. It is the breaking of the civil organism at its joints. And the epic continues through Era's rampage across the land. Cities fall, populations die, survivors flee. The landscape is scorched. Then finally another voice appears. Ishum, Era's second in command, the one who goes before him and lights his way. Ishum asks what the reader is already asking, because the reader cannot help but ask it. Hasn't this gone far enough? What was the purpose? What have we accomplished? And Era's rage begins to subside. He looks at the destruction, and like the gods after the flood, seems to experience something close to regret. Not because the action was morally wrong in any modern sense, but because the devastation has become so complete that even glory has nowhere to land. If everything is ash, what remains to fear you? And then comes the most remarkable reversal. Era dictates that the epic itself be written down and preserved. He promises protection to those who honor the text. Anyone who glorifies this composition will be protected. Any city where this text is kept will be spared. Any house that displays it will be safe. The god of plague becomes, through the preservation of his record, a god of protection protection conditioned on acknowledgement. Keep the record and be spared. Forget the record and invite repetition. And now we return inevitably to the question we've been circling. Since the prism in Oxford, since the floodline, since the laments, since the council votes, what are these texts doing? If the era epic is theology, it is theology that teaches method. If it is myth that functions like instruction. If it is documentation, it is documentation of capabilities exercised, not imagined. Because the epic describes exactly the kinds of catastrophes the archaeological and climatic record shows can happen. Drought, famine, plague, political collapse, cities emptied, trade, disrupted governance, severed. The epic attributes these to a powerful actor making decisions. Geology and history attribute them to natural processes and human conflict. The text insists a will did this, a being did this, and the being did it not from necessity, but from restlessness, from the desire to remind the world that fear exists. And in that, the epic fits the wider pattern more cleanly than we might want. Because the flood is not presented as a random accident, it is voted on. Ur is not presented as merely unlucky, it is decreed. An era's rampage is not described as mere chaos, it is implemented. So the archive offers you again the same structure in a different voice. Decision, authority, deployment, aftermath, and preservation of the record, as if the record itself is part of the defense. Which leads to the next question. One, the archive answers not with councils or policies, but with a boundary, a restricted zone, a place the living are not supposed to enter, a descent into a realm so dangerous that even a goddess is executed for crossing the line. After Era, the archive feels colder, not because it becomes less mythic, but because the logic becomes more explicit. Era is not a god who destroys because he must. He destroys because he is restless, because his weapons have been unused, because fear has faded. He collapses systems not for justice, but for demonstration. And then he commands the record of his destruction to be preserved as protection. As if memory itself is a ward. As if forgetting is what makes repetition possible. So when we turn from Era to Inana, we are not leaving destruction behind. We are moving into something that often follows destruction boundaries. After catastrophe, you draw lines. After contamination, you enforce gates. After systems break, you create restricted zones. And the descent of Inana is at its core a story of a boundary that does not bend. A boundary so absolute that even a goddess cannot cross it without losing everything. Inanna worshipped across Mesopotamia as goddess of love, war, fertility, and political power was not a gentle deity in the texts. She is ambitious. She is dangerous. She transgresses. And one of her most famous myths begins with a repetition that signals deliberation rather than impulse. From the great heaven, she set her mind toward the great below. From the great heaven, she set her mind toward the great below. Inanna, from the great heaven, she set her mind toward the great below. The repetition matters. The text wants you to feel that this is decision, not accident, not stumbling, not being carried. A mind-turning choosing. Why does she descend? The myth offers a reason to attend funeral rites. For Gugalana, the bull of heaven, husband of Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. But the text hints at another motive that hangs beneath the surface like a second shadow. Inanna wants power over the underworld itself. and before she goes, she prepares. She gathers her regalia. She dresses herself in the 7 divine powers, attributes, credentials of authority. She instructs her servant Ninshubur to raise alarm if she does not return within 3 days. And then she descends. The underworld in Mesopotamian cosmology is not a place of moral punishment. It is simply where the dead go. All dead. It is ruled by Ereshkigal, and it is not meant to be visited by the living. The boundary is absolute. To enter alive is to violate cosmic protocol. Inana arrives at the first gate. The gatekeeper Nadi challenges her. "Why have you come?" She explains her purpose. Nedi goes to inform Ereshkigal, and Ereshkigal's reaction is immediate and violent. What could she want? What does she intend? She comes here bringing ruin. But despite fury, the queen cannot refuse entry entirely. The gates must open. The request cannot be denied. So she issues an order that sounds less like mystical poetry and more like security instruction. Let Inanna enter, but enforce the ancient laws at each gate. There are 7 gates between the outer threshold and Ereshkigal's throne. At each gate, something happens that is so procedural, the mind keeps trying to turn it into symbolism, and yet the structure is unmistakable. At each gate, Inanna must remove 1 piece of her regalia, 1 piece of her authority, 1 of her me. At the first gate, her crown. At the second, her lapis necklace. At the third, her measuring rod and line. At the fourth, her breastplate. At the fifth, her golden ring. At the sixth, her royal robe. At the seventh, her undergarment. 7 gates, 7 removals, 7 reductions. Not random stripping, sequential disarmament. By the time she reaches the throne room, she is naked, powerless, stripped of every marker that made her who she was in the world above. And then comes the judgment. The text says the Anunnaki of the underworld surround her. They pass judgment against her. And then it states it plainly without flinching. She was turned into a corpse. The corpse was hung from a hook on the wall. Inanna dies, not metaphorically, not as a seasonal hint, as a corpse, a body on a hook. And the myth insists on this physicality because it wants you to feel the severity of the boundary. Even a goddess is not exempt. Even divine status does not override underworld protocol. 3 days pass. Ninshubur, following instructions, raises alarm. She goes to the gods for help. Enlil refuses. Nana refuses. Only Enki agrees. And his method, again, is procedural, an exploitation of system edges, the way EA exploited loopholes to warn the flood survivor. Enki creates 2 beings, neither male nor female, neither living nor dead. Formed from the dirt beneath his fingernails, he gives them food and water of life. And he sends them down with instructions that are not magical spells, but social tactics. Sympathize with Ereshkigal. Find her in pain. Mirror her suffering. When she offers reward, ask for Inanna's corpse. The plan works. The strange beings enter. They find Ereshkigal suffering, often described as labor pains, illness, internal torment. They do not challenge her. They do not demand. They empathize. They echo her cries. And because they mirror her pain, she is moved enough to offer them a gift, they ask for the corpse. And because cosmic law binds even her, she must comply. The corpse is removed from the hook. The food and water of life are applied. Inana revives. But the underworld has rules. If someone who entered leaves, someone else must take their place. The Anunnaki demand a substitute. Inana ascends accompanied by demons enforcers of the exchange. And now the story becomes a search, not for meaning, but for payment. Who will replace her? She moves through the world above, and those who mourn her are spared. Those who did not mourn those who sat in comfort while she was dead become candidates. Eventually, she chooses Dumuzi, her lover, who had taken her throne, and did not grieve. The demon sees him. He is dragged down. Later traditions soften this into a cycle, Dumuzi and his sister, alternating in the underworld, explaining seasonal patterns of death and rebirth. But the core mechanism remains unchanged. Entry violates boundary. Boundary enforces disarmament. Violation triggers execution. Escape requires loophole. Escape demands substitution. Nothing comes free. Now, the conventional reading sees seasonal allegory here. Winter and spring, death and rebirth. Psychological transformation through ordeal. Political legitimacy through conquest of death. But if we hold the myth inside the same framework, we've been tracing councils, decrees, oaths, enforcement, then the descent reads like something else too. It reads like quarantine, a restricted zone, 7 gates, credentials surrendered at each checkpoint, final judgment by resident officials, execution for unauthorized entry, release only through special intervention, and release only if the system receives an equivalent replacement. And notice how the underworld is described in Mesopotamian imagination, a place where nothing grows, where dust is food, where darkness reigns. Whether or not that is afterlife, it also resembles a dead zone, an area rendered sterile, sealed, maintained under strict control. And if the broader archive is about catastrophe, floods, scorched lands, cities, ruined, plagues unleashed, then it becomes possible to hear Inanna's descent as memory of what happens after catastrophe, the establishment of zones no one is supposed to enter, not even gods. Because some damage may be permanent, some areas may be too dangerous, and the line that separates the habitable from the uninhabitable must be enforced with absolute severity, or the damage spreads. So, the descent myth becomes in this reading not simply a story of seasonal cycles, but a story about boundary enforcement, about a system that strips authority at checkpoints, about officials who execute violators, about rules that demand substitution, and about the terrifying implication that there are places, real or conceptual, where life is not allowed. And if that is the case, then the Anunnaki are not only administrators who decree floods, they are also wardens, they are security, they are the ones who maintain the line. Which brings us back to the flood tablet again, because the flood tablet is not only about water, it is also about sealing. A hatch sealed with bitumen from the inside. A vessel closed against the outside world, as if the outside world is not only wet, but unsafe. We read the flood account again, not for story, but for protocol. Because the protocol may be what the tablets were trying hardest to preserve. We've already walked through the flood tablet once. We've heard the black cloud. We've heard the storm god thunder. We've heard the Anunnaki lift torches that set land ablaze. We've heard the gods gather like flies around sacrifice, afterward hungry, regretful, exposed. But now, after Era's method and Inanna's gates, the flood tablet feels different, because it no longer reads only as catastrophe. It reads as a sequence of procedures designed to survive a world that has become hostile. And if the Mesopotamian archive is in part an archive of survival protocols embedded inside myth, then Tablet C of Gilgamesh becomes one of its densest concentrations. So we return to it, not to summarize it, not to compress it, to linger, to watch the detail, because detail is what you preserve when you think it matters. Utnapishtim receives warning from Ea. The warning is not vague. It is practical. Tear down your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, and seek life. Bring aboard the seed of all living things. And then the tablet gives a line that is not necessary for mythology, but perfectly suited for instruction. The boat must have equal dimensions, length and width the same, a square base, stability, a vessel designed not for sailing but for enduring violent conditions without capsizing. Then the text continues with numbers. Cubits, measurements, not one number, but several repeated anchored. Height, width, length, a structure massive by ancient standards. And again, you can tell the story without this, but the text refuses to tell it without this. Utnapishtim describes laying out the boat's interior structure, compartments, subdivisions, decks, dividing the interior 7 times, dividing the ground space 9 times. Even if the exact numerics are uncertain in translation, the intention is clear: internal compartmentalization. A principle of survivability. If one section fails, others remain intact. And then comes waterproofing. Bitumen, pitch, quantities specified. Exterior and interior treatment distinct. This is not a casual, and then I sealed it. This is instructions for sealing under extreme conditions. And then the time frame construction accomplished in 7 days. And the loading procedure, family and kin. Beasts of the field, creatures of the wild, members of every craft. This is not grab whoever you love. This is preserve the seed of civilization, knowledge diversity, skill diversity, an intentional selection of humans by role, as if rebuilding is assumed, as if the flood is not the end but the break after which reconstruction will be required. And then comes what might be the most quietly unsettling technical detail in the entire tablet. The moment the catastrophe begins, Utnapishtim says I entered the boat. I closed the door, I sealed the hatch, and he sealed it with bitumen from the inside. That is not a simple act of closing the door. That is hermetic thinking. That is the logic of someone who believes the outside environment might not only be wet, but lethal. Water pressure outside, moisture inside. Yes, but also perhaps air safety, perhaps toxicity, perhaps particulate, perhaps heat. The text does not say this explicitly, but it preserves the act, and that act sits beside Inanna's gates and feels like part of the same world, a world where boundaries are enforced because the wrong side of the boundary kills you. Now the catastrophe itself begins. The black cloud rises, storm god thunders. Gods of destruction go before it. Ninurta, bursts dams. Torches are lifted. Land is set ablaze. Daylight turned to darkness. Everything flattened to the horizon. And then after 6 days and 6 nights, silence. The storm ceases. The text says all of humanity had returned to clay. The land was as flat as a rooftop. That line does not behave like poetic embellishment. It behaves like someone trying to describe what the world looks like when all landmarks are erased. No hills visible, no cities, no outlines, only surface, only water. And after the waters begin to recede, the boat grounds on Mount Niger. Utnapishtim waits, then he tests, not once, 3 times, dove, swallow, raven. Only when the raven does not return does he interpret the world as survivable. Again, protocol. Testing external conditions, not assuming safety, not trusting calm. And when he disembarks, the next phase begins sacrifice. Because in their world, sacrifice is not only worship, it is communication, it is negotiation, it is signaling. And when the gods gather around the offering, like flies, it confirms something the text has been implying. All along, these are beings who depend on the system humans maintain. Humans provide offerings. Humans keep temples functioning. Humans keep the administrative economy of divine power running. So when humans are nearly erased, the gods suffer consequences. And now we watch the confrontation. Enlil is furious. No man was supposed to survive. Ea argues, the punishment was disproportionate. There is a pause in the rage, then compensation, immortality granted, exile imposed, a settlement after catastrophe. And the text ends with an image that feels like policy aftermath. Utnapishtim becomes neither fully human nor fully divine, removed from the world, living at the mouth of the rivers, at the boundary, always at the boundary, because boundaries are what the archive keeps returning to, before and after the flood. Heaven and earth split, underworld and surface separated by gates, authority and rebellion separated by oaths, safe and unsafe separated by sealed hatches. So, the flood tablet read carefully is not only a story, it is a chain of decisions, actions, and safeguards measures taken to survive an event described not as accident, but as executive force. And this brings us to the pivot that the archive demands again and again. If catastrophe is described procedurally, then what do we do with the physical record? The Earth has its own memory. Rock layers, sediment deposits, fire traces, drought markers, impact signatures, archaeological gaps. And the moment we ask whether the tablets preserve documentation, we must ask what the planet itself preserves. Not what people believed, but what the ground remembers. So in the next part, we step away from clay and into stone. We move from tablets to geology, from narrative to layers, from councils and decrees to flood deposits, drought events, destruction strata. Because if the Anunnaki War damaged Earth, whether as myth metaphor or documentation, then the Earth should carry marks of that damage. And we have to look, slowly, carefully, without forcing an answer too soon. At some point, if you stay with these tablets long enough, the clay starts to feel like a mirror, not because it answers you, but because it keeps reflecting the same question back at you in different angles, different tones, different genres, king lists, flood epics, war chronicles, laments, manuals, descents. And eventually the question stops being only about what the Sumerians believed. It becomes about what the earth itself remembers. Because whatever you decide about the Anunnaki myth allegory documentation, the catastrophes described in these texts are not gentle events. They are not small. They are the kind of events that should leave marks. So we step away from the museum vault for a moment. We step away from the protective glass and the catalog numbers. And we ask, what does the physical record show? Geology has its own chronology independent of human storytelling. Rock layers record deposition and erosion flooding, and drought volcanic activity impacts sea level changes, climate shifts. And through the Holocene, the current epoch beginning around 11,700 years ago, the consensus is simple relative stability. No global catastrophe in the recent record that resembles a worldwide flood. No sudden universal inundation that wipes out all life. The Earth, in modern geological framing, has been calm. But calm is not the same as eventless, because within that stability there are exceptions. Local floods, regional catastrophes, impact markers debated and contested, drought events that collapse empires, anomalies that do not fit neatly into a single story. And when you look at those anomalies with Mesopotamian texts in mind, a strange compatibility appears not in specifics, not in dates, but in shape. First flood evidence. Flood myths appear across cultures: Mesopotamian Hebrew, Greek Hindu Chinese, Norse, indigenous American traditions. The standard explanation is reasonable floods happen. Rivers overflow, coasts inundate, tsunamis strike. Local events become mythologized into universal catastrophe. And in Mesopotamia, archaeology does show significant flood deposits. Sites reveal layers of water-laid sediment separating occupation levels. Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur famously passed through deep, clean clay that he interpreted as flood deposit evidence in his early framing of Noah's flood. Later excavations complicated that picture. Flood deposits exist at multiple sites, but they aren't neatly contemporary. Different cities flooded at different times. So geology and archaeology steer you toward the local. But the texts insist on the universal. Gilgamesh says, all humanity returned to clay. The king list says the flood swept over, after which kingship descended again from heaven. The Eridu Genesis frames the flood as total annihilation. Either the texts are exaggerating local events into global memory, or something happened wide enough that survivors experienced it as world-ending, even if it wasn't literally planet-wide. And that brings the script to the second anomaly it already placed on the table, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Around 12,800 years ago, climate shifts rapidly, temperatures drop, glaciers advance, megafauna go extinct. Mainstream explanations emphasize climate cycling. Alternative models propose impacts or air bursts, comet fragments, widespread fires, atmospheric disruption, melting leading to flooding chaos. The evidence for this remains debated. But the hypothesis exists in the modern conversation because some markers, thin layers, unusual materials, abrupt transitions invite the question. And the Mesopotamian descriptions, torches in the sky fire, with flood darkness after brightness, map onto what witnesses might say if destruction came from above. The timing doesn't line up with the later Mesopotamian flood deposits around the 3rd millennium BC. But the king list itself complicates time, stretching it into numbers that don't behave like ours. If chronology compresses, if oral tradition carries memory across thousands of years before writing, then the mismatch becomes part of the mystery rather than an immediate refutation. Not proof, not certainty, just compatibility in outline. Third city destruction evidence. Excavations across Mesopotamia reveal burning layers, debris, sudden abandonment, rebuilding phases. Archaeology often attributes these to invasion warfare, earthquake, political collapse, human mechanisms that are plausible and supported by regional history. But the Lament texts attribute destruction to divine decision. Not simply we lost a war, but the assembly decreed annihilation. This is where geology and text diverge sharply, not on whether destruction occurred, but on why and who. A major earthquake could destroy multiple cities, ignite fires, disrupt water systems. Survivors could interpret that through divine language. That is plausible. But the laments preserve procedural framing council judgment, irreversible decree. And that procedural texture keeps the question open, not because it proves divine causation, but because it refuses to behave like a simple mythic overlay. Fourth, climate anomalies. The script pointed to the 2-kilo-year event around 2200 BC, a severe drought lasting decades to centuries, associated with broad civilizational stress and collapse across regions. Causes debated: solar variation, volcanic activity, ocean circulation shifts. The effects are clear enough in many records: reduced rainfall, crop failure, societal collapse. And the era epic describes exactly that kind of world: drought, famine, infrastructure disruption, governance severed, cities emptied. The epic attributes this to a god acting deliberately. Modern framing attributes it to climate systems. Again, the physical event and the textual depiction align in shape while diverging in explanation. Fifth, impact structures. The Earth Impact Database catalogs confirmed craters worldwide. Some impacts occur within human history, small, localized, but dramatic. Witnesses would see fire from the sky, hear explosions, watch forests ignite, feel ground shake, and the Mesopotamian language torches lifted brightness, setting land ablaze from above. Fits what people might say in a world without modern vocabulary. This interpretation shifts the Anunnaki from beings to personified forces. That is a different premise than the documentary reading, but it remains within the spectrum. The script itself allowed the Anunnaki could be literal actors, or they could be the name ancient people gave to recurring catastrophic phenomena. And then we reach the pivot. The script, named outright Geology, can tell you what happened: floods, fires, droughts, abandonments. It cannot tell you who decided. Rock layers don't record intent, they record consequence. So when the texts insist on councils and votes and decrees, we have to ask what kind of document we are reading. And this brings us finally to the 3 interpretive frames. The script laid out the 3 ways to read a war. First, pure mythology. The Anunnaki are invented deities. Flood myths explain floods. Drought myths explain drought. War myths explain city collapse. The procedural language is storytelling texture, not evidence. The impossibilities, 200 years talking weapons tablets that control fate, support this reading. The strength is simplicity. The weakness is dismissiveness. It has to explain why the texts preserve technical detail and bureaucratic tone so consistently. Second, encoded wisdom. The Anunnaki are symbols, natural forces, psychological states, spiritual principles. Flood is transformation. War is order versus chaos. The tablet of destinies is will. The descent is inner ordeal. The strength is depth. The weakness is subjectivity. Allegory can mean almost anything, and it risks drifting away from what the texts actually say they are doing. Third, historical documentation. The Anunnaki were real beings, whatever that means, exercising authority during an antediluvian age. Their conflicts and policies caused environmental and civilizational catastrophe. Survivors preserved memory, scribes recorded it. The strength is directness. The texts mean what they say. The weakness is the burden of unanswered questions. Where is the independent evidence? Where did they come from? Where did they go? Why the absence of unmistakable artifacts? None of these frames can be proven from the tablets alone. But the tablets keep insisting on one thing with extraordinary consistency: catastrophe happened. And the Sumerians attributed it to Anunnaki decision. So perhaps the final question is not, do you believe this? Perhaps it is, what do you do with a record like this? Dismiss it as myth and move on. Study it as allegory and look for wisdom. Investigate it as documentation and search for proof. All three are valid responses. All three have been attempted since George Smith lifted broken clay from a pile of fragments and found the flood story older than Genesis. And now we return one last time to the vault. The climate control hums. The weld Blundell prism sits behind glass. 4 sides, columns of wedge marks. 8 kings before the flood. 241,200 years. Then the line the flood swept over. After that, everything changes. Numbers become human. Reigns shorten. The world becomes ours. And the prism does not explain why. It just marks the division and waits. The tablets do not demand belief. They demand attention. They have endured fire, conquest, excavation, storage, neglect, translation, debate. They are still readable, still asking, what happened to the world before the flood? What broke so completely that even the measurement of time itself changed afterward? Sleep now if you can, knowing the clay exists, the record exists, the question exists. And when you wake, remember this, whether you read the Anunnaki as gods, symbols, or something else entirely, the Mesopotamians were trying to preserve the same kind of knowledge we still struggle to preserve today. That catastrophe can come, that systems can fail, that decisions, human or divine, can reshape everything, and that forgetting is its own kind of vulnerability. If you're still here at the end, listening in your own hour of night or early morning, you can leave a quiet note about where you're listening from, but only if it feels like part of the ritual, not an interruption. Because the larger point remains whether anyone comments or not. The prism waits, the tablets wait, the earth turns, and the question stays open.